So there will always be the temptation for people to act without integrity, and we can't actually do anything to stop people from doing that. But what we can do is help people to see that they can get what they need more effectively by acting within integrity. In hunter-gatherer circumstances, like you mentioned, that division of labor is very biological, and both sides are absolutely necessary. So neither one has more control. The individuals who might end up behaving in a predatory fashion on those around them, and the individuals who are vulnerable to being preyed upon. Both sides come from a sense of incompleteness.
Hi, this is Sifu Slim, author of The Aging Athlete. In this book, you're going to get to hear about two different groups of former high-performance athletes. One group, which is made up of 90% of the former athletes, does not do physical activity on a regular basis and tends to suffer the consequences of a sedentary lifestyle. The other group, which is made up of 10% of the former athletes, is doing physical activity on a regular basis and tends to thrive through the aging process, or at least has a better chance at coping with the aging process. We could have taken these folks to a lab and done all kinds of tests on them. Instead, we slowed them down and sat them down and asked them, in their own words, to describe why they're wired the way they are, so that we all, former athletes and non-athletes, can use some of their inspirational and motivational and mindset lessons in our own lives. I hope you pick up a copy today. You can go to theagingathlete.com, and when you have a chance to read it, I'd love to hear back from you to find out what your thoughts are on the stories of these aging athletes. Hi there, Sifu Slim here, coming to you live from Vienna, Austria. And today's conversation is the second one I've had with Israel Bouseman, who's in Tampa, Florida. And a catchy title for this one is Rage Against the Machine. And it's about traditional versus modern when we talk about relationships and females, the female-male hetero relationship. And it could even be daughter to father or sister to brother, any male-female relationship. What I've noticed, and many people on the media sources have noticed, that there's been a big shift over the last 50 to 70 years. And it's something we want to discuss and come to some observations about and open that up for your comments out in the audience. So with that, I'll bring in Israel, who's a shaman and a healer, does a lot of therapeutic work and coaching work all over the world, based out of Tampa, Florida. Say hello, Israel.
Hello, pleasure to be here with you, man. So yes, I'm Israel. I just published Only Human, an operating manual for seekers and sensitives. And this is a guided tour of the human experience, looking at breath, emotions, attention. So what I do is explore the natural magic of what it means to be human. And I do that both with my books and with personal sessions and training courses and things like that. So it's such a pleasure to be here with you, man. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So Sifu and Israel were having a conversation before we started recording, and it was about perception. So I'm going to ask Israel to share a little bit about his take on how we perceive things and what our perceptions means in terms of facts, reality, and just perceptions.
Okay. All right. So this is such a huge part of what I share with those that I work with, and even with those that I interact with casually. There's so many times that we talk about what's going on in the world, right? And we use our experiences, we use what we have perceived and what we've encountered in our whole journey, right? And the challenge is that we often assume that our perception is unbiased and just what we see, that's what's out there. But that's never really the case. Our perception is a whole lot more biased than we sometimes realize. We're actually conditioned to see what we expect, what we believe, and even certain things that we're primed to relate with in a certain way. And this is all a part of us, but we will look out there and say, oh, this is what's happening in the world. So I try to be very careful, and I try to be very mindful whenever we're discussing conditions of the world, that there are going to be a lot of my perceptions of this world that are related to how I relate with it, not with the world in itself. So I try to be very cautious about making assumptions that my experience or the way that I have interpreted my experience is an accurate representation of the world in some way apart from me. I don't know if I really explained that all that well. Hopefully I touched upon it well enough.
I have no doubt in my mind that you did just as well this time as you did before we started recording, Brother Is.
Fair enough.
So Sifu over here came up with a couple of observations. So instead of sharing foregone conclusions today, I am hopefully going to be received as someone sharing observations, commentary from other sources, some scientific things like from Robert Sapolsky of Stanford, who studies neurology and behavior in animals and humans and how the brain works. So some really cool stuff. My first thing comes from an observation and lots of listening to the sexes, the male and the female heteros out there, and even the non-heteros. I hear some of these same comments. I'm going to say that both sides of the male-female equation are bleeding. So let's start out with that. They're bleeding. There's some suffering going on. There's some discontent. There's some longing for relationships and connection. And I'm going to share that it could be observed that females have put up a wall and men have put up their shields. So in former generations, it might have been women that had more shields. And in terms of the relationships, men out on the battlefields with shields, and out in business world and financial interactions and land interactions with their shields and that type of thing. But now that's the observation that I'm going to share. Females have put up a wall. Thou shalt not cross this wall unless it meets my needs. And men have put up their shields in terms of just getting attacked by females for all kinds of things. So I'm going to start with that observation and see what Brother Is has to say about that.
One of the biggest things that stands out to me is that we as a global society don't seem to really understand the power of the feminine. And we don't really have many healthy models of like the empowered feminine or the empowered masculine growing up. So it's really, really hard for us to actually step into a healthy expression of our natural power and into a healthy relation with the world around us. So, for example, I know that there were some historical threads with this, and we can look at, back in World War II and such, with a lot of the women going into the workforce and beginning to take on roles that were traditionally men dominated. Now in this case, you have like advertisement is very clever, by the way. It helps to condition people to perceive things in certain ways. So you have like Rosie the Riveter as a beautiful advertisement that says, yeah, a woman can do anything that a man can do, which is awesome. But it touches upon something that I think I saw in your notes before we got on here. It confuses equal value with sameness. And the value of the feminine is very different. The gift, the power of the feminine is very different than the value and the gift and the power of the masculine. So a lot of times women growing up in this society, disconnected from these healthy feminine models, will try to become powerful and become free and equal by taking on those masculine qualities, which in this case is seeking, accomplishing, sometimes winning or dominating, or stepping into a position where we are independent and not needing any support from others. So this is a juvenile reaction in a way. You can feel the lack of something, and so you try to compensate for this lack by producing power in the terms that you understand. Well, it leaves a lot of women walking around with a really strong masculine. Now, I'll say this. One of the things that I see gets so confusing in this particular society, the feminine, is the energy that supports us in terms of tuning in, being aware of what's happening around us, softening to receive. And the true power of the feminine energy is invitation. Just like you got the bee as an expression of the masculine energy and the flower as an expression of the feminine. That flower is in control. That flower is making the whole thing happen. but it's not pushing or forcing or exerting force in any masculine sense that we would understand. It's simply inviting. And in the process of invitation, the whole world moves to meet it. This is incredible, and this is a power that every single human being can learn to connect with and meet within themselves. So I've got more on this, but I know I've been speaking for a minute, so I wanted to open the floor and see whatever you might have to share with regard to that, or
yeah, the invitation is very helpful. And when I'm coaching people, I say it's an invitation to come to a program tomorrow morning that involves balancing your connection of mind, body, spirit, and karma, and whatever else you'd like to have in that conversation. So it's not, it's definitely something that there's a commitment. We're going to meet at 7 a.m., let's say, and we're going to watch the sunrise, and there's going to be a connection. But it's not a personal training program where I'm going to say, and 1, and 2, and 3, and then over, and 4, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be more a Sifu that's like a master yogi mixed with a physiologist, mixed with shaman, mixed with Native American medicine person, mixed with someone who's there to listen to you, and he's using that intuition. And if you let it in, the intuition can go in and have these incredible connections, and hopefully solving some of your woes that you haven't been able to solve because of your schedule, your inhibitions, whatever it is. And so I say it's an invitation, and I hope that people treat that with its proper honor, because it's a connection with two people, the universe, and many other forces are involved. And I think the invitation is a great way to look at this. And I think so often in the modern era, we've monetized the role of the man. That's quite common. Men tend not to marry for financial resources. Women do. And it's not something that, this is one thing that I'm fast and hard with in general, and generalities are valid. That's what that women even say in the conversations. And I listen to thousands of these on talk radio. They're looking for stability, security, and resources of the man. And that hasn't changed as far as I know in the history of the world. Now, there are men out there who could be looking for resources as well, but it's very common that the man has different things that he's looking for than the woman. So if this invitation is being seen as a connection, a collaborative event, a helping event between two people where they make a commitment, and they're going to watch each other and care for each other and listen to each other and experience each other and grow with each other. That's what I think we're sadly missing, which I find very readily available in the time of my grandparents. And it wasn't even a question, in my opinion, for my grandmother to be cooperative, to be feminine, to be strong when needed, to watch the fort, to raise the kids and the grandkids. I mean, she was the rock of Gibraltar in my family, and she did it with a soft heart, an open mind, a caring mind, and a lot of wisdom. So I think it was not uncommon to have grandparents like that when I was born in the early 60s. Over to you, Israel.
There's a lot of interesting stuff that comes up with that, because for one, humans have such a truncated view of history. We look back 30, 40, 100 years, and we think that's a long time, So when we're looking at the relation between men and women in this particular case, we might, for example, look back at the biological tribal hunter-gatherer segregation of roles based on biology, and we might look at the arrangements that were during your grandmother's time, during my grandmother's time, where this similar division of labor was arranged in a really, really practical way. It was a practical arrangement. And in fact, this idea of romantic love and the Disney style relationship, I mean, it was seeded a bit back, but it has really come more into how we perceive and what we expect in a relationship in the last 20, 30 years, like back in our grandparents' time, they had a much more practical view of what was required in the situation. And they also, in general, didn't have so many temptations dangled in front of them with electronic devices. You had the people in the town you grew up with, and in general, you had a little time to figure out if you could vibe with them. Wasn't like you had all the options in the world. So there was a lot of practicality to these arrangements that, as our options have grown, as the different sources of information have changed, we've stepped away from a lot of that, you know? Now, an interesting thing here is, like, you've mentioned that you've listened to what people say, right? And it would be great sometimes if people were rational, if people actually said what they really meant, and what they really meant was actually fitting with what they needed or what they're experiencing. And I grew up listening to the complaints of my mom and her girlfriends about how men behaved and things like that, and early on in my life, I tried to take that on, and I tried to adjust my behavior so that I would not have those undesirable masculine traits that they were complaining about. And what I realized way, way too late, that a lot of these traits were the same traits that were actually desired. That sometimes when people are just getting up and complaining about things or talking about things, it's not really reflective of what they truly want or what they truly need. So I'll tell you, women on a practical level may seek out, in general, guys that have resources or things like that. But at a core level, there's something way, way more powerful. At a core level, all of the infinite dances of the feminine have one single purpose. And that purpose is to call the masculine to presence. So these infinite dances, they might come in terms of nagging or seducing or nurturing or supporting or any of that. They're dances. They're part of the beauty and wildness of that core feminine nature. And what the masculine can do in those situations is to offer presence and offer stability and to create a container for that wildness to just express itself in all ways that it can. And the thing is that the feminine responds to that presence, So we might have these ideas that women in general are looking for this, and there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of lostness in society, but on a person-to-person level, when it comes down to your interaction with the people in your life, if you bring that quality of presence in, and you can help the woman in front of you to feel seen and to feel safe in being seen, that trumps all of it.
I think that's very valid. I think if I didn't say this clearly, what I should have said is that the observations and comments of women and of psychologists who have dealt with counseling people in relationships have jotted down in the 5 main requests and expressed needs, desires of women, and the 5 main requested and desired needs of men. And there's not one thing on the list of men that's on the list of women. And that's somebody from Minnesota who wrote this book. His needs, her needs, a psychologist who's had 10,000 patients. And he's what I would call an astute, humble, caring, intelligent man who's now, if he's still living, would be in his 80s. So that's one book I'm drawing on, and a lot of experience. And then I'm drawing on listening to a few YouTube podcasts where it's women calling in, talking about what they want, and having someone who's an alpha male ask them questions to take an hour of interaction with a man and boil it down into 3 to 8 minutes. And he's very good at doing that. And so that's what I'm basing that on. And then having watched my sisters, my mother, and their friends, as you have, Israel, and looking at all of these things. So I agree with you that what they're expressing may not be what's in the unconscious mind, may not be what solves their pains and what gives you the ultimate connection with the feminine and with the woman that you've given your heart and mind and caringness to. But I had to start with somewhere, and so I was starting with the express needs in these conversations and in these books that I've read by people who've dealt with women in terms of coaching people and providing therapy for male-female relationships. Your turn.
Well, I have a question for you. So you said the main 5 needs for the men and the main 5 needs for the women, as expressed by them and as spoken of by this scientist. Do you know what they are? Would you be able to?
I do, and if I may, I'll open up my
Right on.
if you have something to share while I open this up, I'll be happy to let you speak for a minute while I find it.
Well, one of the things that had gone through my mind a bit before we got on this call is I had a beautiful experience. I was able to spend a year in Sydney, Australia, and during that year, a friend of mine and one of my most cherished teachers was setting up a Tantra temple in Randwick, Sydney. Right, so this Sydney Tantra temple was in operation from probably September 2014 to September 2015. It was just the 1 year. And during the time that I was there, I was able to help them set things up in the very beginning. And then every once in a while, I had the opportunity to help, tend fire during one of the women's circles. But mostly, I had time to interact closely with Eve and with Tara. It was Eve Glemma, Tara Fisher, and Madeline Snell setting up the Sydney Tantra Temple in Randwick. And I got to spend a lot of time holding space and listening to what they had to share. And one of the beautiful things that I learned about this is like a lot of times the typical response of a man when we hear a woman expressing an issue, saying, I've got a problem with this, is to think about that problem logically and then offer a solution. And one of the things which was so valuable for me to learn then was that that is not the response that is generally sought after. So the response that is generally sought after is just what I described to you already, that quality of presence, that quality of depth of care. And that comes across without any words. Like a lot of times, I've found that when a woman is expressing her upset, her challenges, or whatever like that to me, if I can simply hold space for it and offer that presence and depth of care, she gets to her answer herself. She doesn't need me to offer some, let me figure it out for you. But she did need that time of being seen and allowing that to process in order to get that clarity.
So I am honored that you shared that last bit, but I couldn't help while you were sharing that, Israel, to think of the philanderer, of the sociopathic salesperson who can't miss. Some people call them rainmakers. They can sell refrigerators or ice boxes to Eskimos. These people, oftentimes the males, have that same ability as pickup artists, including their secretary, including walking into the pub or the dance hall or the disco and walking out with a woman of their choice, whether they are a gorgeous model-looking person or just a person who knows how to push those buttons. And there are books written by these people and there are videos all over the internet done by these people or who've learned the skills of these people. And that's the difference I think I have in attempting to be authentic and genuine and not playing a role, not doing a performance just to bed a woman. So I'm a person who seeks out a connection with a female, not a quickie as the saying goes. So that's the one thing I would hope that people would get from this conversation today, is that by spending time with you and your coaching and with me and my coaching, they would learn to diffuse that sociopathic tendency, that acting tendency, the getting what I want now tendency, and seeking to not create PTSD for other people out in the world, selling them things they don't know, convincing them to do things they shouldn't do, picking up a woman who's 27 and really wants to find a significant other, maybe for life, and just betting that person and messing up their female hormones and giving them PTSD and another person in the body count. And so but the biology says if you do that, more body counts equal less pair bonding for the female because of oxytocin and other hormones, and just because of trust issues and waking up the next day and feeling unfulfilled and having regret and sometimes calling it in as a date rape. All of these things we've seen for decades. If in the media of my life, I've seen this, and these are the things that I think need to be discussed in terms of men getting to the point that you said, Israel, where they're really connecting on this very special, honorable level, it's completely different than the person who can play that role and who has an ulterior motive. Your time to share on that, Israel.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. When people understand people better, they can use that understanding in ways that lack integrity. And that sucks, but that is the temptation with any power or any ability. And understanding is a huge power. It's a huge ability. So what I was discussing, what I was sharing with you, requires presence and depth of care. So presence in general requires that we put down what we want from the situation in order to create space for what's going on with the person in front of us. And depth of care is where it comes in with that authenticity that you're talking about. Like if you actually truly care about the person that you're sitting with, then being able to share space with them is more important than what you might want to happen in that space. Now, it's interesting because both sides, both the individuals who might end up behaving in a predatory fashion on those around them, and the individuals who are vulnerable to being preyed upon, both sides come from a sense of incompleteness. This is what makes people vulnerable, a feeling like they need something from someone outside, a feeling like they need validation or support in order to be safe, or love from others in order to be worthy, or things like that. And this is something that actually, it goes beyond the issue of the masculine and the feminine and goes directly into the core of like the human condition here. So many of us feel like we're lacking something, and we're trying to get that thing that we're lacking from the middle world, from our relationships, our habits, our possessions, from our ideas and things like that. It is incredibly, incredibly powerful to be able to offer attention and care, because that's something that people in general feel a lack of. They don't really know how to meet themselves in that way. And it's amazing though, like in meeting others in that way, so long as we listen to our boundaries, we have less incentive to try to manipulate or pressure the situation to be anything other than what it is. Because this actually, in offering this connected presence, this gives the one who's offering something fundamental that we've been missing as well. So there will always be the temptation for people to act without integrity, and we can't actually do anything to stop people from doing that. But what we can do is help people to see that they can get what they need more effectively by acting within integrity, by honoring the person that is in front of us. And actually, okay, so what it really comes down to is respect, right? And you'd shared prior to our conversation a link about what it means to be submissive in relationship. And it seems like we were discussing the falling away of women from the traditional roles in society and the moving away from that quality of submissiveness. And you'd mentioned as well that there are many webcasts and many sermons and things like that that are being done on this very same topic. I looked at it, and all of the qualities of submissiveness in relationship sounded to me like respect. And it sounded to me like respect that really needs to come from both sides. Because in any relationship, there are going to be some areas where an individual is pushing and where the other is holding space for that pushing. But it's not only going to be one person pushing all the time and the other person accommodating all the time. There will be a tendency to dance, to flow. Sometimes my needs will be loud, and it will be my responsibility to express them and take what action I can to make sure those needs are met. Sometimes the needs of someone that I care about will be important, and it will be important for them to express that. So I see, like, especially with such an imbalance and especially with such lostness around it, to require or request submissiveness on either side could easily lead people to feeling oppressed, already when they feel like they have a lack of power in their own lives, whereas coming at it from a perspective of mutual respect gives space. It gives space for that accommodation, which is the core of the desire for submissiveness, without forcing either side into preconceived roles, which probably won't work for us as well these days. So I've gone off on that for a bit now, so I'll open the floor here to anything you might like to share.
Yeah, no, wonderful, Israel. That was good. I love the way you use language and metaphor to help explain those points, and so that's been very helpful. And what I wanted to share before I go on to some other topics is we brought up traditional roles, and I want to draw the connection between biology, neurology, survival, and roles. So I've spent a fair amount of time over the past 15 years reading up the books about male roles in hunter-gatherer societies and farming societies and industrial societies in inner city life, like our ancestors who may have come from Europe in the late 1800s, early 1900s to the Eastern Seaboard, living in tenement buildings, these types of things. How did they work all these things out, and why did they wind up in those roles? So the first thing I want to talk about is childbearing. And if you're in a hunting and gathering society where you're nomadic and moving 3 miles to be near cleaner water and away from your sewage is a very common thing, and it happens frequently in most of the hunting and gathering tribes that I've read about that weren't like Santa Barbara. We've got Native Americans who live there, and they still own a casino and these types of things. But if you're thinking further back and you're away from the ocean, away from things like the Hawaiian natives, if you're in a nomadic tribe, the woman is not going to go into estrus as easily. There's going to be less fat on her body typically, and carrying a child is fatiguing. And so it worked out to be not having a child every year to 2 years, like in sedentary villages that happened in other parts of the globe and in later times often. But the original nomadic people who, upright walking things whose fossils can be dated to 6 million years ago, which is a long time, would often because of having to carry that child and having to move a lot, not have a lot of fat on their body, and their biology knew not to go into estrus and not to experience a pregnancy with an insemination. So that allowed them to just worry about one child at a time. So there wasn't, when you have 5 children, there's more chaos, typically, more need of other people to help out, and your time commitment is substantial. You couldn't just put one kid on your back and go out and gather roots, berries, and help hunting and find the next campsite. Moving campsites is quite difficult for many people too, especially the people who lived in colder climates and had more things to carry for warmth and for preservation of meat and fruit and tubers. So when I take a look at the nomadic hunting and gathering people, where you may have had a child that was being cared for every 5 to 6 years, just as an example, we're talking millions of years, and not just Homo sapiens, but upright walking entities. So you're looking at a relationship that's completely different than a sedentary village, where you could have, if there was farming resources or hunting resources nearby and water nearby, you had an easier time of providing sustenance for yourself. And you may have had a child every 8 months, every year and a half, and then all of a sudden you wound up with 5 kids under the age of 12 at the same time. And that's a completely different dynamic. And if it wasn't a different man fathering each of those childs, where the expression, it takes a village to raise the child, and this is the idea that the man doesn't know he's the father, so he cares for every child in the village like they were his own. This is just one example. It's a completely different dynamic and experience for all people in that tribe or that band, that village, than if you were in a nomadic hunting and gathering tribe where there's one child every 5 to 6 years. Over to you, Israel.
So I find this a really, really interesting topic personally. And this goes back to the bit of like how we have a much shorter view of history than we sometimes realize. So for example, I'll use an example that's not really all that far back in history. I have Cherokee ancestry, and we often assume that the patriarchal arrangement is that which is natural, biologically supported, and dominant in human experience. But that's not actually true. So, for example, with the Cherokee, you have the rulers were the council of grandmothers. You know, you might have a man who stands in like leadership position of the tribe as like an active like the active war chief or whatever like that, but the council of grandmothers would decide on all major decisions based in the 7 generations down. And the council of grandmothers would only okay it if they could see that the results would not be negative or they would even be beneficial 7 generations down each decision. So you actually get and unfortunately, I don't remember the source of this one right now, but it was another one that was looking back into prehistory and that transition from the hunter-gatherer to the more citified, you know, the civilized, if you will. And what it was suggesting was that actually matriarchy came first. So you got the guys, they roam around, they go out, they gather, they're away from the home place. You've got the gathering of the women. They're in charge of the home place. They determine what happens. All right. So now we get not just a natural male-oriented biological division of the labor related to the sexes. Now we get a much longer story. So we get a period, thousands of years of patriarchal domination that is actually a response to, we don't even know how long, of matriarchal domination, where you had the beginning of the establishment of the feminine community as the central pillar of human society, and that was pushed too far in the opposite direction. So what we get here is the imbalance. In hunter-gatherer circumstances, like you mentioned, that division of labor is very biological, and both sides are absolutely necessary. So neither one has more control. Neither one has more power. There you have the equality in difference, you know? But then as soon as you have one side determining what's happening, one side calling the shots, then you have an imbalance of power, which is gonna press for the opposite direction. So what I see really is not just a period where women have lost their way in society and, you know, we've lost the traditional forms, but actually like thousands of years of imbalance between the sexes and also imbalance between humans and the natural world that are beginning to work their way through into our awareness and into our understanding that we have to address it in a way that works for us better.
So, Israel, I wanted to talk to you a minute. I'm glad we shared some commonality in that evolutionary history, which is really interesting. And we could do another talk on that. The book Sex at Dawn, the book of the monogamy myth. These are fascinating books, and I'm not holding them out as pure scientific truths. I'm holding them out as very interesting books that give you indications of a variety of thoughts about evolutionary history and male and female roles. The most interesting thing that I think I take away from, I think it was Sex at Dawn, was the notion that when you moved into land ownership, you took one person who was able to own the land, or a small group of people are able to own the land, and they had the power. And so you have a man who doesn't own the land who has to go work on the land of the person who owns it to provide food for his wife and his 3 to 6 children back home, living in poverty, kind of like the one-room shacks of the Irish potato famine and the 5 of them in the 1800s. You have this poverty, lots of kids, and eating simple meals, trying to survive. but they have to go over and work their tails off, maybe 10 hours, 12 hours a day for this dominant male who owns the land. Now, the dominant male, to control this thing, he's going to hire thugs or henchmen, like you've seen in the TV show Batman from the 1960s, the Riddler, the Joker. They all had these henchmen that were to carry out their will. And so the person who owned the land had those people, like the mafia don, who's got all of the sergeants and these other people under him, and the made men. And so his job, and these people get a lot of good food, they can get big and strong, whereas the person, even though they're working in the field, they're worn down. They're not just strong working in the fields. If they did that for 6 hours, they might be strong field workers and be able to overthrow them. But because it was like almost being in a work camp in the Nazi times. You're so exhausted from your 10 to 12 hour work, and maybe being whipped and maybe being abused by these henchmen, that you go home and your wife and your number of kids, they're looking at you possibly as this beaten down person without a lot of musculature, without an upright posture, and without any control or ease towards a survival. So this person who owned the land, and his son, and you can see this in all kinds of pieces of literature and cinema, they can go and seduce, hopefully, or attack your wife when you're working out in the field, or your daughter or your sister. And this was not an uncommon thing, because that's how these dominant sociopathic and maybe even psychopathic males had the opportunity to operate. I'm not saying in every case, but this was not uncommon. So now they're screwing up the relationship you have between your family. You're not getting the sustenance you want, the freedom, the chance of progress that you want, and your walk in life. And this could have happened with slaves in the hunting and gathering tribe, which did happen. They would invade other tribes and enslave people to do all the work. And in Genghis Khan's time, and this has been obvious. But now you're seeing this in a farming village. You could pick a time in the Middle Ages. Would not have been common to see something like this. The movie Braveheart shows you the lords coming by, and you're at your wedding, and them beating you up and taking your wife, and having intimacy. Not the better word is the R word that we're not supposed to say on the internet. And this is painted throughout literature. And this was the people who write these books. They talk about the difference between the sedentary village, where there might have been more equality, to the time where you move into land ownership, more along the lines of 10 to 14,000 years ago from our current era. And they're showing this as a negative, that the dominance of the landowner gave them just too much power to have sway over these regions. Over to you, Israel.
There's a few different threads in there, and they're all really awesome. So one of the threads, there's so I spent a while as a freelance writer, and one of the things that I did was 50 different summaries for classical psychology and philosophy texts, which is awesome. 10,000 word summary with each one, that'll bone you up on it. One of these texts was The Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorstein Veblen. And it was probably one of those works that influenced Karl Marx later on with his whole idea of the theory of class and class conflicts and things like that. So Thorstein Veblen was describing a similar thing as to what you were just describing, the early development of the farming village, and then you get people who are coming in, maybe they got horses, maybe they got weapons instead of hoes and things like that, and they come in and they demand at the point of a sword whatever these people have grown.
Subjugation.
Well, yeah. And essentially on a long enough timeline, any two organisms that interact with one another will end up forming kind of a symbiosis, not a pure symbiosis, but say you got like wolves and deer, right? You need the wolves around, because without the wolves, the deer population would grow too much, and then it would take out other things, right? They form a balance to one another over time. So you get these predatory raiders essentially, and you get these sedentary growers. And over enough time, they don't have to raid so hard anymore. They kind of got it arranged. We're just going to come in here. You're going to give us stuff and we don't have to kill you. This is just how it works. So eventually, you get the development of the noble class in a situation like that. Now, an interesting thing about this is it doesn't happen until we're growing things that we can store. Because if you're just growing stuff that you can only just harvest as much as you got to cook that night, it's like, come give me your potatoes. It's like, dude, they're right there. Go for it, man. I ain't stopping you. But once you got things like meal and flour and stuff that can be stored, then all of a sudden it becomes worthwhile for these individuals who are not, in this case, producing, to use their might to gain the resources that were produced by these others. Now, this doesn't necessarily address the masculine feminine quality so much, but there is a part which, like you mentioned, the pathological quality of it. Basically, you get these raiders that are essentially cruel, dominating, willing to act in violence to get what they want. And what we're getting there, that comes back to what we're talking about, is an expression of the shadow side of the masculine, like the dark god quality, right? And it's not just what we would say with alpha, right? Because you get a lot of, kind-hearted, caring, sensitive males these days who are proud to not be alpha males, because there's this assumption that alpha is that same imbalanced, psychopathic, harmful, and cruel quality. But one of the things that we're lacking in this society is that in order to be a healthy, empowered male, we actually have to make peace with our shadow side, with that part of the dark god that has the capacity to be cruel, that has the capacity to dominate, that has the capacity to fight and defend. We actually have to make peace with that and integrate that into our whole being before we can draw upon the strength that it offers in a balanced way. Like you see, like if you were to see somebody who was really big and strong and they were coming up to you and they're trying to bully you, right? You might see that strength on the outside is actually covering up a sense of insecurity. Well, that would be one of those cases in which their dark masculine qualities are unintegrated with the rest of their being. So they have to come out in an imbalanced way where they're pushing their weight around and showing their ability. You know what I mean? And in this case as well, it comes to that same, the core is the lack of integration, right? And I know I skipped a bit because first we were talking about sociology and the early development of the human forms of society, hunter-gatherer, civilized. And now I made a jump to talking about the masculine as it's expressed in modern society. It's very easy for us to listen to the complaints about this unintegrated masculine and refuse to integrate our own masculine in response. Oh, I don't want to be like that. But the thing is that if we do that, then we'll actually end up expressing those same traits when we try to cut that part of ourselves off. So, and I know I'm taking a tangent, but it's all right. So the same thing actually operates with women, So the qualities of the dark goddess are the qualities of deceit and manipulation and seduction. And there's a power to this that is connected to the power of invitation. But when it is out of balance and unintegrated, then these abilities, this influence is often used without integrity and not to anyone's benefit. So the core here, to me, is to see that the imbalance is a result of lack of integration, and it's a result of that which needs to be healed. And that which needs to be healed is actually addressed on an emotional, not an intellectual level,
I agree. No question.
So I think I took us a bit away from the sociology, but
no,
we got a wide open floor now.
We're running with that canoe trip that we've talked about. We're thoughts pop in and we examine them, and I share something that gives you a thought, and we have to follow that thought. So I'm going to share Robert Sapolsky from Stanford. All right, Robert Sapolsky, and this is a gentleman who's my current take on one of the coolest scientists, especially neurologists, who's got animal experience living with baboons for 30 plus summers, and lots of work and research and neurological investigations, including surgery in California as a professor at Stanford. So he talks about how he studied baboons, and he picked an animal that he didn't like. They weren't nice to each other. There was constant fighting, stabbing, backstabbing, whacking kids, dominating women, beating each other up, just really nasty behavior. And here's what happened to the baboon troop that he had studied, who experienced a massive death of the dominant males in a few hours' time. So I'm going to break into this 9-minute video at 3 minutes 45 seconds. Why hierarchy creates a destructive force within the human psyche. Robert Sapolsky.
The first troop he ever studied, the baboons he felt closest to and had written books about, suffered a calamity. It would have a profound effect on his research.
The Kikarok troop is the one I started with 30 years ago. And they were your basic old baboon troop at the time, and which means males were aggressive and society was highly stratified and females took a lot of grief, and your basic off-the-rack baboon troop. And then about, by now, almost 20 years ago, something horrific and scientifically very interesting happened to that troop.
The Kikarok troop took to foraging for food in the garbage dump of a popular tourist lodge. It was a fatal move. The trash included meat tainted with tuberculosis. The result was that nearly half the males in the troop died.
Not unreasonably, I got depressed as hell and pretty damn angry about what happened. You know, you're 30 years old, you can afford to expend a lot of emotion on a baboon troop, and there was a lot of emotion there.
For Robert, a decade of research appeared to have been lost. But then he made a curious observation about who had died and who had survived.
It wasn't random who died. In that troop, if you were aggressive, and if you were not particularly socially connected, socially affiliative, you didn't spend your time grooming and hanging out, if you were that kind of male, you died.
Every alpha male was gone. The Kikarok troop had been transformed.
And what you were left with was twice as many females as males, and the males who were remaining were, you know, just to use scientific jargon, they were good guys. They were not aggressive jerks. They were nice to the females. They were very socially affiliative. It completely transformed the atmosphere of the troop.
When male baboons reach adolescence, they typically leave their home troop and roam, eventually finding a new troop.
And when new adolescent males would join the troop, they'd come in just as jerky as any adolescent males elsewhere on this planet, and it would take them about 6 months to learn, we're not like that in this troop. We don't do stuff like that. We're not that aggressive. We spend more time grooming each other. Males are calmer with each other. You do not dump on a female if you're in a bad mood. And it takes these new guys about 6 months, and they assimilate this style, and you have baboon culture, and this particular troop has a culture of very low levels of aggression and high levels of social affiliation, and they're doing that 20 years later.
And so the tragedy had provided Robert with a fundamental lesson, not just about cells, but how the absence of stress could impact society.
Do these guys have the same problems with high blood pressure? Nope. Do these guys have the same problems with brain chemistry related to anxiety, stress hormone levels? Not at all. It's not just your rank, it's what your rank means in your society.
There we are.
Yes, sir.
Were you able to hear that, Israel?
Yes, yes, I was able to hear it. And yeah, I was loving it. So have I mentioned with you the Toltec wisdom at all?
No, I'd love to hear it.
Okay. So there's a fair bit out there. One of the easiest introductions to it is the work of Don Miguel Ruiz. His book, The Four Agreements, is actually pretty widely known by now, and it's a great introduction to the whole perspective and set of practices. But what is actually coming to mind now is his introduction in A Mastery of Love. And what Don Miguel Ruiz does in A Mastery of Love is describe human society in a way that it's kind of a Plato's cave thing, you know? If everybody's in the cave, that's just the whole world. So, what are you going to say about it? But if you have some basis for comparison, if you have some other way to look at it, then suddenly you can describe the cave in a way that people who have been there their whole lives have never noticed, And one of the qualities that he mentioned was the mind parasite, So humans have been living in this hierarchical, domination-oriented, not just civilized, but civilized imbalance of power for a very long time, for long enough to actually think that this is natural and this is the result of progress, rather than the fact that it's a result of a mental illness. And it's a contagious cultural level mental illness that basically causes us to lock up our pain and fear and then end up sharing that with others. When we get hurt, we'll end up tensing up to hold it in, trying to protect ourselves. And then when we encounter someone who we have more power than this person, then we can vent and share this emotional toxin with this other person, So it ends up creating a situation of imbalance that we share without even realizing that we're sharing it. Like the track of civilization, like what you're talking about with, like very similar to that baboon tribe, it's taught, and you can see an unbroken line of imbalanced relation with nature, with one another, and even with the divine that goes all the way back as far as we have written records. This same mind parasite, the same social parasite of imbalance and domination has been informing the structure of human society at the very least since Sumer. And the crazy thing about it is, just like those baboons, right? If you were to talk to the baboons before they had that instant, like that situation happen, that's what they would tell you. If you could have a conversation with them, that's what they would say life is like. Life is always like that. It's always going to be like that. It's always been like that. Why are we even talking about it? But we saw in that situation that as soon as the individuals who were perpetuating the imbalance were taken out of the situation, then the population had the opportunity to return back to its natural balance. So part of this mind parasite is connected to land ownership because it's connected to the idea of separateness. Because only with separateness can you have the idea of property, and then it comes in with the whole, like, I have the right to whatever property that I can enforce, whether that's with physical enforcement or in this more refined era with legal and money enforcement. It really comes down to an application of force in accordance with an individual's desire. And a lot of that, again, to medicate a sense of pain and insecurity and fear that we learn to carry from very young and never really learn to address.
Yes, aloha on that. Yes. It's interesting that in the troop of baboons that he showed, even though that was the history of baboons as far as he knew it, the people who study chimps will say the same thing about chimpanzees, not bonobos. It's interesting that the males who were left didn't seek dominance over that 20-year period. They maintained their culture, they maintained their true nature. If they were a non-aggressive male, they maintained that. They didn't go fill in for the alpha male, the jerk as he calls them, and take over the tribe. And in the current chimp societies that I've read about, the dominant male always has someone that he's beaten the hell out of, maybe repeatedly, who now is his henchman. All you need is one henchman, because 2 against 1 can attack any of these other individual males, or maybe even 2, because you have the one person who gets big and strong, he gets all the best food, he's got the henchman that gets all his scraps, and everyone else has to deal with the calorie intake and the hard work that they have to do to forage for food. So these 2 males will run that troop until illness, until that henchman leaves or collaborates with other people to overthrow that male, or until they're out on a gathering or a hunting expedition and the neighboring chimp troop kills one or both of them. Those are the things that typically throw off that alpha male leading that band of chimpanzees. The women don't band together and overthrow him, and the other males don't band together and overthrow him, at least in the literature that I've read, which I've been doing for about 20 years. In the bonobos, it's different. When there's a fight going on, the women won't allow that. They'll either go up and turn their posterior and do what's called a quickie, and in 15, 18 seconds, that aggressiveness is waylaid because of an ejaculation. Or they'll go up and they'll just protect. 2 or 3 will go up if somebody's bothering someone who's near and dear to them, their child, their sister, what have you. They will go up and gang up on that person and kick them out of there, so that they refuse to live with that dominant violence. And so 2 similar troops of animals, the chimps and the bonobos, they roll completely differently. And this to me is one of the most fascinating things of the zoology that I've had the chance to study.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful example, because I would say in this case, the bonobos are showing some of the power of the feminine, and I've heard some of the studies with chimps, similar to the ones with baboons, that the warlike behavior and the overly aggressive behavior in chimps is learned as well. And that's one of the biggest things that we don't see growing up in this society. It's everywhere around us. So we believe that progress and property and domination is just how humans go if you give them enough time. But the history of colonialism is a history of people taking the lifestyle they had learned and spreading it to all of these people who had been happily surviving, happily in balance with the world around them for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years, when these people came up and tried to show them this way. And it's this same it's the same contagious idea and contagious way of living that has just been passed along and passed along and passed along. And part of it does come in with that establishing an imbalance between the masculine and the feminine. There's an example that I love about this, and it draws from some different sources. So in the first book of the Essene Gospel, is an account of Jesus's instruction to the lepers. And in that book, there is a description of the Lord's Prayer in a very similar way to how we hear the Lord's Prayer these days, in the beginning, and then it shifts, So our Father who art in heaven, this is the beginning of the Lord's Prayer, right? Goes through the half that we're familiar with. Our mother, who is the earth, right? Has a whole other half to it, where we're honoring the goddess just as we have honored the god. Now, the first thing that you have to do, think about what you said about how the chimp got his henchman. He traumatized him. And same thing the military does, same thing any type of unethical training does. You traumatize the person, you break them down, and you can build them back however you want. If you traumatize the person, then they'll be vulnerable to these hooks or these kinds of imbalanced lessons that we have to share. We traumatize, we offer the model, they take on the model because they learn that's the way to address the trauma and put themselves back together, right? So with humans as a society, the first thing that you have to do in order to traumatize that society is cut off its connection to the feminine. Because the connection to the feminine keeps us grounded. It keeps us centered. It keeps us connected to tribe. It keeps us embodied, connected to what our body is feeling like right now. You cut off that feminine presence, awareness, connection, and in-tuneness, and you can lead that masculine as far as you want down a story. And if you tell the right story, then ends justify the means, man. You can justify any cruelty, domination, or aggression. You know, once you bring, just like the bonobos did, once you bring that healthy feminine back in, all of a sudden, those explosions of this conflict of ideas or this conflict of interests, it has a bit of a buffer, and it's linked back into what's going on with the tribe rather than that nucleus of idea or will in that one moment.
I'm very pleased we had part one of this discussion. I have lots more to share, and I'm sure you do as well. I'm going to end this one, and I'll send you an email momentarily, and you can respond to that, and we'll go from there. How's that sound, Israel?
Sounds great, man. Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm Sifu Slim. The book that I have that's closest to the conversation that we've shared today is Sedentary Nation. It's the history of physicality related to sociology and psychology and survival that goes from the hunting and gathering people through the farmers, through the industrialists, to the service-oriented society, and now the digital-minded and digital-seeking society of desk, couch, car potatoes. And you could take a look at that, and I hope you find that intriguing, and I hope that helps you with your own wellness. It's a wellness guide as seen through our evolutionary history. You want to share some of your initiatives, Israel, and then we'll sign off.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So publish this guy, Only Human, an operating manual for seekers and sensitives. And this is, so basically what I've been doing for my whole life is exploring all of the different religious, magical, and spiritual perspectives that I could, looking for the core of truth, taking fragments from each one and putting it together into something very, very human. It's the core of magic. It's the core of consciousness. And for our own journey with this, we see it through the lens of the human body and the human experience. So what I do with my book and with my courses is work with people to reconnect with our fundamental human qualities. Like, so breath, everybody's got breath, and the breath determines the foundation of our experience. It determines the brainwave, emotion, attentions, our relation with ourselves. So this is really what I like to do. I love stories, and stories are amazing, but there's a level of learning that goes beyond stories, and we can get there a whole lot easier by using the body itself. So anyway, that's just a little touch of what I do. I do personal sessions. I run courses to help people step into the fullest magic of their human experience.
And my website I'll give, and then you can give yours. On mine, sedentarynation.com. I'm Sifu Slim. Over to Israel for his website.
Thank you, brother. So that's onlyhumanwisdom.com.
Perfect. Aloha. We're asking for likes and subscribes, and please leave your comments down below. We'll try to answer them. Until next time, peace.
Thank you so much, man. Have a good day.